The small town where he grew up was quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least thought they did. Neighbors smiled when they passed by, shopkeepers greeted customers by name, and on the surface life seemed peaceful. But for one boy, the peace others felt was something he had never known. His name was Ethan. He was the quiet one at school, the boy who sat in the back row, never raised his hand, and always wore long sleeves, even when the summer heat made everyone else roll theirs up. Teachers thought he was shy. Friends said he was just the quiet type. But no one really knew what he carried inside. Every morning he would walk to school alone. His shoes were worn out, his backpack a little torn at the edges, but he didn't complain. He'd learned long ago that keeping quiet was easier than explaining things people wouldn't understand. When classmates laughed or played around him, he forced a small smile, just enough to blend in but never enough to invite questions. At home, life was different. His father, once a strong, proud man who used to tell jokes at the dinner table, had become someone Ethan barely recognized. Years of disappointment, lost jobs, and bad habits had changed him. His mother, once full of laughter, had grown quiet too. She moved around the house like a shadow, doing what she could to keep peace, though peace never lasted long. Ethan often stayed in his room, trying to make himself invisible. He'd listen to the creak of the old floorboards, the ticking clock, the sound of his father's boots across the living room. He always knew when to stay still and when to move. Sometimes the tension in the air felt heavier than the walls themselves. When nights were calm, Ethan would lie in bed and stare at the ceiling, tracing tiny cracks in the plaster with his eyes. He dreamed of other places, of the ocean, of big cities where no one knew his name, of freedom. But mornings came too fast and the dreams faded like mist. At school, he tried to focus. He liked reading, especially stories about people who overcame hard times. It made him feel less alone. There was one teacher, Mrs. Turner, who noticed his love for books. She often handed him novels to borrow and said softly, "You have a kind heart, Ethan. Don't let life make it hard." He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. But those words stayed with him. Outside of class, he avoided attention. When other boys played basketball, he watched from a distance. Sometimes they'd call out, "Hey, come join us." But he always waved them off, pretending he was too busy. He wasn't shy, he was scared. Scared that someone might see the marks on his arms, the ones he tried so hard to hide. Evenings were the hardest. The sound of the front door closing always made his stomach tighten. His father's mood could change like the wind, calm one moment, stormy the next. Ethan tried his best not to do anything that might set him off. He did chores, kept his voice low, and tried to stay out of sight. But sometimes, no matter how careful he was, anger still found its way to him. There were nights when he'd slip out quietly to the backyard just to breathe. The cool air felt like relief against his skin. He'd sit under the old oak tree, the one that had stood there longer than anyone could remember, and look up at the stars. Someday, he whispered to himself, I'll go somewhere far away. Somewhere no one can hurt me. He didn't tell anyone about what really happened at home. He'd seen how people reacted to others' problems. Pity, judgment, gossip. He didn't want that. So he built walls, silent ones that kept everyone out. His scars, some visible, some not, became secrets he carried alone. Still, there were small moments of light. Sometimes his mother would sit on the edge of his bed after his father had gone out, her eyes tired but soft. She would whisper, "You're stronger than you think." He never said it back, but he believed her, even if only a little. As he grew older, Ethan started spending more time at the library. It was quiet there, safe. The librarian, an older man with kind eyes, noticed how often he came and began saving books for him. "You've got a sharp mind," he said once. "Keep feeding it. Knowledge can take you places you can't imagine." Those words planted something inside Ethan, a small spark of hope. He started to plan quietly. He saved bits of money from odd jobs, mowing lawns, cleaning yards, anything that would earn a few dollars. He hid the money under a loose floorboard in his room, one small step toward freedom. One afternoon after school, he walked past the train station and stood watching the trains roll in and out. The sound of the engines filled him with longing. Each whistle felt like a promise of escape, of a world beyond the small town where his pain lived. He wondered where all those people were going, if any of them were running from something too. When his 18th birthday drew near, the thought of leaving became more real. He didn't know exactly where he'd go or what he'd do, but he knew he couldn't stay. Every scar on his body reminded him of the life he wanted to leave behind, not to forget it, but to grow beyond it. In those final months before he left, he started writing in an old notebook. He didn't write about what happened in detail, just how he felt. Sad, angry, tired, hopeful. The pages became his silent friend. He didn't know it then, but those words would one day become his way of healing. On the night before he turned 18, he sat by his window, the moonlight falling softly on his face. The house was quiet. His father had gone out. His mother was asleep. He opened his notebook and wrote, "Tomorrow I start over." He didn't pack much, just a few clothes, the notebook, and the small amount of money he had saved. Before leaving, he stood for a moment in the hallway, looking at the closed doors, the faded wallpaper, the house that had both made and broken him. He didn't hate his father. He didn't even fully understand him, but he knew he couldn't live in the shadow of that pain anymore. With a deep breath, he opened the front door and stepped outside. The night air was cold, but it felt clean, like a new beginning. As he walked down the empty street, the stars above seemed brighter than ever. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time he wasn't afraid. The scars he carried weren't just marks. They were proof that he had survived. Somewhere deep inside, he knew his story wasn't over. It was only beginning. And someday, maybe, those same scars would tell a story no one could imagine, but one that could change lives. The city was louder than anything Ethan had ever known. Cars rushed by like waves. Lights blinked everywhere, and people moved fast, each lost in their own world. It was nothing like the small town he'd left behind. At first, the noise scared him, but soon it became a comfort. In a city that never stopped moving, no one noticed a quiet boy with a backpack. That was exactly what he needed, to disappear and start over. He found a small room to rent above an old grocery store. The walls were thin, the window cracked, but it was his. For the first time, he had a place where no one shouted, no one slammed doors. The silence felt strange at first, but it slowly began to feel like peace. Finding work wasn't easy. He had no experience, no connections, and very little money. He went from store to store asking for jobs. Most people shook their heads or told him they'd call. No one ever did. Still, he kept trying. He cleaned tables at a cafe for a few weeks, helped unload boxes at a warehouse for a few more. The work was hard and the pay was barely enough, but he didn't complain. He was free, and that was enough to keep him going. Sometimes, when he walked home after long days, he'd pass the bakery at the corner. The smell of fresh bread filled the air, warm and sweet. It reminded him of the mornings when his mother used to bake before things changed. He'd close his eyes for a moment, letting the memory stay with him. It made him feel less alone, but life wasn't easy. There were nights he couldn't afford food, days when the landlord knocked on his door asking for rent he didn't have yet. The fear of losing everything followed him like a shadow. There were times when he thought about giving up, but he didn't. Every scar, every memory of pain, reminded him that he'd already survived worse. One evening, after a long shift at a construction site, Ethan cut his hand on a piece of metal. The wound was deep and he couldn't stop the bleeding. He didn't want to go to a hospital, he couldn't afford it, but the pain was too much. He found a small community clinic nearby and went in. Inside, the waiting room smelled like disinfectant and old magazines. He sat quietly, holding a rag around his hand. A nurse came out and called his name. She was gentle, calm, and spoke in a voice that made him feel safe for the first time in a long while. "Let me see that," she said softly, unwrapping the cloth. Her eyes caught the faded scars on his arms, but she didn't ask about them. She didn't look shocked or pitying, just kind. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" she asked, not expecting an answer. He stayed quiet, unsure what to say. After stitching his hand, she handed him a bandage and smiled. "Take care of yourself. You're tougher than you think." He nodded, thanked her, and left. But those words stayed in his mind. Tougher than you think. He had heard something like that before from his mother. It felt like a small light inside him had turned on again. As weeks turned into months, Ethan started to find rhythm in his days. Work, eat, rest, repeat. He was still living simply, but there was a small sense of control in his life now. He found a job at a small garage fixing cars and cleaning tools. The owner was strict but fair. For the first time, Ethan was learning something useful, something that gave him pride. He liked the smell of oil and metal, the hum of engines. Machines made sense to him. They broke down, but they could be repaired with patience and the right parts. Maybe people were the same, he thought. Maybe broken didn't mean beyond fixing. On weekends, he walked to a nearby park and sat on the same bench every time. He brought his notebook, the one he'd started back home, and wrote in it. Sometimes he wrote about his day, sometimes about his thoughts. He didn't write about the past directly, but the feelings found their way into his words. The notebook became his quiet companion, a place where he could put his pain and leave it there. One afternoon, while sitting in the park, a little boy accidentally kicked a ball near him. The boy ran up smiling and said, "Sorry, mister." Ethan smiled back and tossed the ball to him. The boy's mother waved and thanked him from a distance. For some reason, that small moment made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: connection. He realized how long it had been since he'd spoken to anyone beyond simple work talk. That evening, he walked home with a strange mix of sadness and warmth. He was learning that healing didn't come all at once. It came slowly in small moments, in gentle reminders that the world still had kindness in it. The days ahead weren't all easy. There were nights when he couldn't sleep, when old memories came back like ghosts, but he had learned how to calm himself. He'd take deep breaths, remind himself that he was safe now. The walls around him didn't echo with shouting anymore. The silence, once heavy, now felt like safety. One rainy day, on his way home from work, Ethan passed a small bookstore. In the window was a sign, "Free coffee night, open reading for anyone." He hesitated but decided to go inside. The smell of books and fresh coffee felt comforting. People sat in small groups reading poems and short stories. He listened quietly, watching the faces of those who shared their words. Some were nervous, some confident, but all were honest. For the first time, he thought maybe he could share something too. One day. He didn't go home that night feeling lonely. He felt inspired. These were people who had found a way to turn their stories into something beautiful. Maybe he could too. Over time, Ethan began to open up little by little. He started talking to people at the garage, helping new workers, learning to laugh again. He was still quiet, still careful with his words, but his walls weren't as high anymore. Sometimes he even helped the neighbors carry groceries or fix their bikes. Small acts of kindness became his way of giving back. One afternoon, while working at the garage, the same nurse who had treated him months before came in to fix her car. She recognized him instantly. "You've been keeping busy," she said with a smile. "I try to," Ethan replied, smiling shyly. They talked while he worked, mostly about simple things: weather, work, the city. When she left, she said, "You seem better than the last time I saw you." "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think I am." That night, as he sat in his small room, Ethan thought about her words. He was better. Not healed completely, but better. The scars on his arms were still there, but they didn't feel like chains anymore. They were reminders of how far he'd come. He looked out the window, the city lights flickering like stars below. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time he wanted to find out. He wanted to live, not just survive. Maybe he would start by reading at that bookstore or helping others like him someday. Before turning off the light, he opened his notebook and wrote, "I'm not the same person I was. I'm learning to breathe again." He closed the book gently and smiled. Outside, the rain had stopped. The streets glistened under the city lights, and somewhere in that glow, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. He didn't know that the path ahead would lead him to people who would change his life again, or that one day, his story would help others find their strength. But that night he rested peacefully, knowing that every scar, every step, had brought him here, to a place where healing had finally begun. Years passed slowly, but in those years, Ethan began to find pieces of himself he didn't know existed. He was no longer that frightened boy who hid behind long sleeves and silence. He still carried his scars, but they had started to mean something different. They reminded him of how far he'd come, not how broken he had been. He still worked at the garage, fixing cars with patience and care. The job was steady, the people around him kind. Life was quiet, almost peaceful. But sometimes, late at night, when the city lights faded and everything grew still, the memories came back, soft but heavy. He didn't run from them anymore. He let them come, breathed through them, and reminded himself that they were only memories now. One afternoon, his coworker mentioned that a local youth center was looking for volunteers. "You're good with kids," the man said. "You should try it out. They could use someone like you." Ethan laughed a little, unsure. "I don't know about that," he said. "I'm not great at talking." But the man insisted, and something about the idea stayed in Ethan's mind. That weekend, he walked by the youth center just to see it. The building was small, with colorful murals painted on the walls, smiling faces, bright skies, words like hope and change. He stood outside for a while before finally stepping in. Inside, the sound of laughter filled the hall. Children played games, drew pictures, and talked loudly over one another. It was noisy, but it felt alive. A woman at the front desk greeted him warmly. "Looking to volunteer?" she asked. Ethan nodded nervously. "Yeah, I guess so." She handed him a form and said, "We always need people who care. Even just listening helps." He filled out the form and left, not sure if he'd come back. But a week later, they called, and he decided to try. His first day at the youth center was awkward. He wasn't sure what to say to the kids or how to act. Some of them were quiet, others loud, but most carried a kind of restlessness he recognized. He saw himself in their eyes, the same mix of pain and hope. One boy, small and thin with shy eyes, reminded him so much of his younger self that it almost hurt to look at him. As days went by, Ethan found ways to connect. He helped the kids fix old bikes, played simple games, and sometimes just listened. He realized that sometimes people didn't need advice, they just needed someone to hear them. Slowly, they began to trust him. And in their laughter and their honesty, he began to heal a little more. One afternoon, while helping the kids paint a wall mural, his shirt sleeve rolled up slightly. A boy noticed the faint scars on his arm and asked quietly, "Did that hurt?" Ethan froze for a second. He could have pulled his sleeve down and laughed it off, but instead he looked at the boy and said softly, "Yeah, it did, but I got better." The boy nodded and didn't ask again. That small exchange meant more to Ethan than he could explain. For the first time, he had told a part of his truth without fear. Word spread among the staff that Ethan had a calm way with the kids, especially those who struggled the most. The center asked if he'd be willing to speak to a small group about overcoming challenges. At first, he said no. The idea of standing in front of people and talking about himself terrified him. But later, while writing in his notebook, he thought about it again. Maybe his story could help someone else the way others had helped him. The night of the talk, he stood in front of a small group, some kids, some parents, a few volunteers. His hands trembled, his voice shook, but he spoke anyway. He didn't share details about his past, only the lessons it taught him. That pain doesn't last forever, that kindness can save lives, and that scars can become symbols of strength. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment before people started clapping. He wasn't sure what to do, so he just smiled shyly. It was one of the proudest moments of his life. After that day, something changed. People began to approach him, not out of pity, but respect. They saw a man who had been through hard times and still stood tall. And for the first time, Ethan allowed himself to feel proud, not of what had happened to him, but of what he had become despite it. He continued volunteering, spending more evenings at the center. The more time he spent there, the more he realized how many people carried invisible scars. He met teenagers who had lost parents, kids who had seen things no one should see, and adults still trying to rebuild their lives. He listened to them all, offering quiet comfort when words weren't enough. One evening, after a long day, he sat on a bench outside the center. The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft gold and orange. One of the boys he'd helped came to sit beside him. "You always seem calm," the boy said. "Were you always like that?" Ethan smiled faintly. "No," he said. "I used to be angry, scared even. But I learned that holding on to pain only makes it heavier. Talking helps. Helping others helps more." The boy looked thoughtful. "You think I can get better too?" Ethan nodded slowly. "I know you can. You already started by asking that question." That night, as he walked home, Ethan felt a quiet warmth inside. It wasn't happiness exactly, it was peace. A kind of peace that came from knowing his pain had found a purpose. He started writing again more than ever. His notebook was almost full now, pages filled with moments, lessons, small victories. He didn't write to escape anymore. He wrote to remember. Each word was a step forward, a reminder that his story mattered. Months later, one of the volunteers suggested sharing some of his writings on a community website. Ethan hesitated but agreed. He posted a short piece titled, "The Things We Survive." It was simple, honest, and came straight from his heart. To his surprise, people began responding, thanking him for his words, saying they saw themselves in his story. Some even shared their own. Reading their messages brought tears to his eyes. For the first time, he understood that his scars weren't something to hide. They were bridges that connected him to others. Life continued quietly but not emptily. He still worked at the garage, still went to the youth center, still wrote in his notebook. He didn't have everything figured out, but he didn't need to. Healing wasn't a finish line, it was a journey. Every day he woke up and tried again, and that was enough. One late evening, as he locked up the garage, he caught his reflection in a window. The same scars were still there, faint but present. He smiled at them, not with shame but gratitude. They were part of him, but they no longer defined him. Walking home under the dim streetlights, Ethan realized something. For years he had believed his scars were proof of pain. Now he saw them as proof of survival. Each one was a chapter in a story he was still writing. A story that, piece by piece, was turning into something beautiful. And as he reached his door, he thought quietly to himself, maybe my scars were never meant to be hidden. Maybe they were meant to help others see that healing is possible. He didn't know it yet, but this was just the beginning of a new purpose, one that would soon change not only his life but the lives of many others who, like him, once believed they would never heal. Ethan's story was slowly spreading beyond the youth center. The short piece he had written online kept reaching more people every week. Comments poured in from strangers who said his words gave them strength, who thanked him for being brave enough to share something so real. He hadn't expected any of that. For a while he didn't even know how to react. But after reading through those heartfelt messages, he realized something. People were starving for honesty. They wanted to feel seen, to know they weren't alone in their pain. Still, Ethan didn't think of himself as someone special. He wasn't famous or wealthy. He was just a man who had survived, working at a garage, living a quiet life, helping where he could. Yet somehow his small story had reached hearts far away, and that humbled him deeply. One day, the director of the youth center called him into the office. She smiled warmly and said, "We've been asked to take part in a community project, something that focuses on stories of resilience. They want to feature a few people who've made an impact here. I think you'd be perfect for it." Ethan's first instinct was to refuse. The idea of being on camera or speaking publicly again made him nervous. "I'm not sure I'm the right person," he said quietly. The director just smiled and replied, "You don't need to be perfect. You just need to be yourself. That's what makes your story powerful." He thought about it for a few days, unsure if he had the courage. But when he went back to the youth center that weekend, one of the boys he mentored ran up to him holding a small drawing. It was a picture of a man standing in front of a bright sun with the words, "Thank you for helping me see the light again." That small gesture made up his mind. Maybe this project could help more people like that boy. Maybe it was time to stop hiding completely. The day of the interview came faster than he expected. The filming crew was small, just a few people with cameras and lights, but Ethan's hands still shook as they set up. The interviewer, a kind woman with a gentle voice, asked him simple questions. What helped you keep going? What do your scars mean to you now? What would you tell someone who feels hopeless? He answered slowly, choosing his words carefully. He didn't dramatize anything or speak like someone giving a speech. He just told the truth in the plainest way he could. He spoke about kindness, about finding purpose, about learning to forgive, not just others but himself. When it was over, the woman smiled softly and said, "Thank you. That was beautiful." Ethan smiled back, still uncertain, but a quiet peace filled his chest. A few weeks later, the short documentary went online. At first, only people from his community saw it. But then it began spreading quickly. People shared it across platforms, quoting his words, writing about how it made them reflect on their own lives. Some even called him the man whose scars told a story of hope. He never expected such a reaction. Every time he read a message or watched someone comment about how his story helped them face their fears, he felt a warmth he couldn't describe. It wasn't pride exactly, it was something deeper, a sense of connection, a feeling that maybe all the pain he had endured was finally being transformed into something meaningful. The local paper did a small story about him too. They photographed him standing near the youth center mural, sunlight falling across his face. The headline read, from silent struggle to shared strength. His co-workers teased him good-naturedly, calling him the famous guy from the garage, but underneath the jokes was genuine respect. For the first time, he felt like he truly belonged somewhere. Even so, Ethan stayed humble. He kept showing up to work, kept volunteering, kept writing. He didn't let the attention change him. But something inside him had shifted. He was no longer hiding from his past, he was learning to use it. The pain that had once trapped him was now becoming a tool to lift others. One afternoon, the director of the youth center approached him with another idea. "We're starting a new support group," she said, "for young adults trying to rebuild after tough experiences. I think you could lead it." Ethan hesitated. "I don't know if I can do that," he said. "I'm not a therapist." "You don't need to be," she replied. "You just need to listen. That's what you're best at." He agreed, though he was nervous. The first meeting was small. Just 4 people sitting in a circle in one of the center's quiet rooms. They didn't talk much at first. The silence was heavy but familiar. Ethan understood that silence. So he started by telling a small piece of his own story. Nothing too detailed, just enough to open the door. Slowly, the others began to speak too. One young man talked about losing his job and feeling worthless. A woman shared how she was learning to forgive someone who had hurt her deeply. They didn't cry or shout. They just spoke and listened, and for the first time in a long time, they felt seen. After that first session, Ethan walked home with a strange mixture of sadness and hope. He realized how much pain people carried quietly, the same way he once had. But he also realized that by sharing his scars, he had given others permission to show theirs too. The group grew over time. More people joined, and each week the room filled with stories, some heartbreaking, some full of quiet triumphs. Ethan became the anchor in that space. He didn't preach or tell people what to do. He just guided them gently, reminding them that healing took time and that every small step mattered. His writing also grew deeper. He started keeping 2 notebooks, one for his personal reflections, another filled with lessons from the group. One night, as he reread his old entries, he saw the transformation written across the pages. The early entries were filled with confusion, fear, and guilt, but the later ones spoke of hope, connection, and forgiveness. It was like watching a wounded soul slowly learning to live again. Months passed, and the support group became a small community of its own. They celebrated each other's milestones, someone finding a new job, another reconnecting with family, someone else starting therapy for the first time. Ethan felt proud of them all. They were proof that pain didn't have to end in darkness. Then, one evening after the session, a woman from the group stayed behind. She said quietly, "You know, when I first came here, I didn't think I'd make it another week, but hearing your story changed everything. You made me believe healing is possible." Her voice trembled and she smiled through her tears. "Thank you for not giving up. Because if you had, people like me might have lost hope too." Ethan didn't know what to say. He simply nodded, his eyes wet. That night he walked home under a soft drizzle, the rain blending with his quiet tears. But they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of gratitude. He finally understood something. His scars weren't reminders of what he'd lost. They were reminders of what he had survived and how much he had gained since. They were no longer wounds to hide, but symbols of hope for others to see. As he reached home, he sat by the window, looking at the night sky. The city lights flickered like distant stars. He thought about how life had changed, not in grand, dramatic ways, but in small, gentle ones. He had gone from being invisible to becoming a light for others, even if just a small one. In that moment, he whispered softly to himself, "If my pain helped even one person heal, then it was worth it." He didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid of it. He had found purpose, connection, and peace, and that was more than he ever thought possible. Months passed, and Ethan's life began to feel like a story that had found its rhythm. The support group continued to grow, and every meeting brought new faces, new stories, and new moments of quiet courage. People came not just to speak, but to listen, to share the weight they had been carrying for years. Ethan had become something of a guide, though he never called himself that. He always said he was just another person learning to heal, one day at a time. The small documentary about him was still being shared online, reaching places he never imagined. Sometimes he'd receive letters at the youth center, handwritten notes from people thanking him for giving them hope. One was from a woman who said his story helped her forgive her father. Another was from a man who had been thinking of giving up, but changed his mind after watching Ethan speak. Each letter humbled him. He read them all carefully and kept them in a small wooden box at home. It wasn't about fame for him. It was about knowing that his pain had finally turned into something good. Still, he knew there was one last chapter of his story that remained unfinished. The past he had run from for so long was still there, quiet but waiting. His father was old now, sick and living alone in the same small house where Ethan had grown up. He hadn't seen him in years. The thought of going back filled him with unease, but also with a strange kind of calm. He had spent so much of his life trying to move forward that he realized he couldn't do it fully until he faced where it all began. One cold morning, he decided it was time. He took a deep breath, got in his car, and drove back to his hometown. The streets looked smaller than he remembered, the houses quieter. When he reached his old home, he parked outside for a while, watching the front door. The paint was peeling, the windows slightly fogged, but it still looked the same. His heart pounded as he knocked. His father opened the door slowly. Time had changed him. His once strong frame was thinner, his hair now white and his eyes softer than Ethan remembered. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then his father whispered, "You came back." Ethan nodded. "Yeah, I did." They sat at the small kitchen table, the same one Ethan had known as a child. The silence between them was heavy but not angry, just full of years that had passed without words. His father's hands trembled slightly as he poured them both some tea. After a while, he said quietly, "I heard about you. The video. The work you do." His voice cracked a little. "I'm proud of you." Ethan didn't know what to say. He wasn't sure if he was ready to forgive, but he also didn't want to hold on to the pain anymore. "I'm not here for the past," he said softly. "I just wanted to see you." His father nodded slowly, eyes glistening. "That's enough," he whispered. They talked a bit more about simple things, the weather, the town, the people they once knew. It wasn't a deep or emotional reunion, but it was real. When Ethan left that afternoon, he felt lighter. The anger that had once lived inside him had finally quieted. He realized that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting or excusing. It simply meant choosing peace. Back in the city, Ethan returned to his routines. The youth center had planned a small community event to celebrate stories of resilience. They asked him to be the final speaker. At first he hesitated, as he always did, but this time he didn't let fear hold him back. "All right," he said. "I'll do it." On the day of the event, the hall was full. Families, friends, and strangers all gathered to listen. As he stood backstage, he felt a mix of nerves and gratitude. He wasn't the same man who once hid behind long sleeves and silence. He was someone who had turned pain into purpose, fear into compassion. When he walked onto the stage, the room fell quiet. He looked out at the crowd and saw faces filled with expectation and warmth. He took a slow breath and began to speak, not from notes, not from memory, but from the heart. He talked about how scars can be more than reminders of pain. They can be proof of survival. He spoke about kindness, about how one person's understanding can change a life. He told them that healing isn't a straight line, and that it's okay to stumble, to feel lost as long as you keep moving forward. His words were simple, but every one of them came from a place of truth. At one point he paused, rolled up his sleeves, and showed the faint marks on his arms. The audience stayed silent, listening closely as he said, "For a long time I hated these. I thought they made me weak. But now I see they're not signs of shame. They're signs that I survived. They're my proof that pain can become strength." The crowd erupted in applause, but Ethan only smiled softly, humbled and grateful. After the event, people came up to him, shaking his hand, hugging him, thanking him. Some cried. Some just stood quietly beside him as if words weren't enough. Each face reminded him of the boy he used to be, the one who thought he would never be free. Now he was standing here, living proof that healing was possible. In the weeks that followed, his life continued in gentle rhythm. He kept leading his group, kept writing, kept helping wherever he could. His story had traveled far, but to him the greatest reward was still in the small moments. The laughter of the kids at the youth center, the relief on someone's face after sharing their truth, the quiet peace of watching a sunset with no fear of the past. One evening, he returned home from the center, tired but content. He sat by the window with his notebook and opened to a fresh page. The night outside was calm and the city lights glowed softly. He began to write not about pain, but about gratitude. Gratitude for the people who had helped him, for the lessons he had learned, and for the strength he had discovered within himself. When he finished writing, he looked at his reflection in the window. The man staring back at him wasn't broken anymore. He was whole. His scars were still there, faint reminders of what he had been through, but they no longer hurt. They told a story of endurance, of healing, of hope. And for the first time, Ethan smiled without hesitation. His scars had once been a secret, but now they were his truth. They told a story no one could have imagined, and it was a story worth sharing again and again, so others could find their own light in the darkness.